It's great to be with you, Olaf. Olaf Sakkers is a South African-born Israeli, is that correct? Yes, more or less.
That's basically right,
That's
yeah.
basically right. And I never know where
with
you
a Norwegian name.
With a Norwegian name, so I just
which,
go
Which
figure.
just confuses people.
Yeah. So, and I never know where you really live, whether it's on a plane, if it's in New York, if it's in Tel Aviv, or elsewhere.
I like to maintain the mystery.
You're an international man of mystery. But above all, Olaf is general partner of RedBlue Capital, which is a relatively new venture firm. He had been one of the founders and partners at Maniv Mobility. And those of you who don't know Maniv, it was really a trailblazer in terms of a very focused, mobility-focused venture firm based in Tel Aviv. Made a lot of very interesting early investments in some of the coolest companies in the field. Olaf is also a member of the CoMotion Global Strategic Council, so thank you for that. We're very honored to have you. And most of all, he's my go-to guy for when I want to know really what's happening in sort of the investment area in deep tech and mobility. He's got a very, very smart and differentiated take on things. So Olaf, we were chatting recently about sort of the imperative of reaching the Paris climate agreement goals and what that means for the mobility space. And I know this is something that you think a lot about and sort of keeps you up at night. So let's just give me a little bit your take and what the implications are for the investment outlook.
Well, basically, if you look at carbon emissions, there are lots of different sources of them. But transportation is basically the largest. It's kind of tied with a few others for carbon emissions. But it's the one we literally don't believe we can decarbonize. Like everything else can go basically down to zero. If you hit the most aggressive Paris targets, by 2070, everything else can potentially go down to zero. Transportation becomes 90-something% of total emissions at that point. And if you think about it, there are a few problems with transportation that make it like that. The first problem is when you buy a car, you're buying this thing that you're going to own for a decade. So if you want to stop people from buying one kind of car and shift to another kind of car, that's going to take a decade from the moment everybody has made that final decision of purchasing an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion. So you've already got a decade delay built in there. But in the meantime, what's happening in India, Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, those cars that we're getting rid of after a decade are getting moved over to those economies for those people to drive. So they don't go out of the system, they get driven there instead. So it's almost impossible. I mean, it's a very, very slow process of shifting powertrains.
So what are the implications of that? I mean, what do governments have to do? Does government have to be more aggressive in forcing the private sector to meet these goals? How does that work?
So I've got a somewhat counterintuitive or controversial view on what actually has caused this problem. And it's actually subsidizations going to the wrong things. And the wrong thing is towards car ownership, towards subsidizing. And I think we all conveniently don't think that we're the beneficiaries of welfare subsidies, it's the other guy. But almost everybody in the middle class is benefiting from massive subsidization of car ownership. If you think about the parking spaces that your car, and I'm sure almost everybody in this room owns one, needs in order to go to the store, to go to work, etc., for the most part, those are incorporated into the building codes of real estate. If you build a new restaurant, you need to provision parking. You need to build a new church. If you build a school, you need to build a certain amount of real estate. And the guy that doesn't own a car is still paying for that in his taxes, right? So this whole method of owning cars is basically being propped up by subsidization from the government, which is all fine and good if you say there's no other alternative, right? But I think over the last few years, we've seen viable alternatives really start to scale, in addition to transit, which is, I think, the original alternative, but hard outside of dense areas. I think Canada is much better than the US, and Europe's much better than the US, and most other countries are, in terms of actually creating dense enough ecosystems for transit. But what we've seen over the last few years is the emergence of what I call, and wrote a book about, the trip economy. So on the one hand, you've got things that take you places, Uber, and ride-hailing. And I think for the most part, regulators have seen these things and try to hammer them down and slap them into place, even though they're, for now, subscale systems and competing against a heavily subsidized alternative. And then we've got what I think people don't think about as part of the same ecosystem, inbound trips, so things that come to you. So Amazon is kind of the obvious example, but Canada's biggest company, Shopify, is getting very heavily and enabling now for a long time e-commerce deliveries to people, food delivery, grocery delivery. And I think people think of these things kind of like, oh, they're luxuries, they're a little bit wasteful. But what you see over time happening with these fleet services is they much, much more rapidly electrify. Uber right now is partnering with Hertz to launch Model 3s for their drivers. I mean, this is today's news. And that means that Ubers have the potential much more quickly to shift to electrification. They're not doing it because of charity. They're doing it because it's cold business logic. Total cost of ownership is lower for electric vehicles if you use them a lot. UPS, FedEx, Amazon, they're going to be the fastest fleets to electrify. And they're going to be way faster than people getting their Biden-subsidized third electric vehicle, which is a Hummer EV, which is sucking lithium into its belly and wasting it, just parked somewhere most of the time while somebody drives the other car or doesn't drive any of them.
Well, on that very point, Olaf, I loved the blog that you guys put together, I think last week or a couple of weeks ago, about American, and I would obviously include Canada in that, car obesity. That what we're simply doing in electrification is we're moving from gasoline-powered massive SUVs and heavy SUVs to the Rivians and the big electric SUVs. Whereas if in other parts of the world, as you pointed out, in India, where you've invested recently in an EV company, and China, the future seems to belong to $3,000, $4,000 pared down EVs. And what are the implications for that for the innovation cycle?
Yeah, there's a picture I really like in USA Today of somebody in in Dallas, Texas, with their Ford F-150 parked outside the garage, but it can't go inside because it's too fat. It's overweight, and there's no space in the garage because the garage wasn't built big enough for the size that American cars have grown into. And I think this is just a natural consequence of subsidization. Yeah. If you don't pay the true cost of your car, then you're just going to get a bigger car than you need because you basically are getting told. I think the perfect counterpoint to what's happened in America with car obesity is Japan, where you've got very lean. And Japan's a wealthy, you could say India, I mean, we put $28 million into a company that's making electric vehicles for Amazon in India, and there's a whole story there that's super interesting. But in Japan, it's a wealthy country, it's very successful. But if you want to own a car anywhere in Japan, you have to have a private parking space. And you need to have somebody come from the government to basically inspect your parking space and make sure that you've got a private set of real estate to park this car. If you think about New York City, why is parking free in New York City? Real estate isn't free. There's multiples of the size of Central Park that have been given over to car spaces where these cars can sit and rust and depreciate.
Let's not talk about Los Angeles, by the way.
And New York's the most dense example of, but in Tokyo you don't have that, and so you've got a super dense city. Yeah. And if you think about it, if you build a city in such a way that you've got all this free space for cars, the whole city expands, like Detroit, it just expands. And then the cost of moving water goes up, the cost of moving electricity goes up. The option to walk disappears because you have to walk like a car. You can't walk like a person anymore. If you want to ride a bicycle, you can't ride a bike like a person on a bicycle. You have to ride a bike like a car. You've got to ride super fast. So maybe e-bikes can bridge that gap. But we've got these super spread out cities, unnecessarily so when we build them around cars.
Well, there is a whole argument that's I'm beginning to hear across sort of the landscape that regarding the built environment is that maybe we should just throw out zoning altogether. The zoning impedes the built environment to evolve quickly enough to embrace the kind of zero emission transportation future that we need. So, let's just example.
I think if you go to a city that hasn't had good zoning, like Sao Paulo maybe, it's not necessarily the solution, right? Like not to have any central planning organization, because there is a trade-off in how public space is used, and I think some kind of coordination and planning is important. But if you look, and I think the West Coast of America is probably the hotbed of these problems, but they're global problems. I think this is one of the untold challenges of our generation is the political disarray in dealing with housing problems, and in particular, special interests. Again, the other guy, not us, but I think everybody has the self-interest of NIMBYism. I don't want somebody building a building that affects my view or my lighting, but your actions or individuals' actions on an individual level have systemic consequences, such that in San Francisco, where this is most acute, LA, where you're based, but even in Vancouver, cost of housing is super high here, and it's because it's really hard to build new things, and so people can't afford to live in the city. You've got increased homelessness.
Yep.
You've got all these epidemics that result from it, and you don't have upward mobility and opportunity because nobody can afford real estate.
Yeah. Just one last question. I know we're running a little bit over time, but you're here, RedBlue Capital, new, very dynamic venture firm investing in future mobility. Vancouver and this sort of web of this sort of public-private collaboration where we see a lot of public support for innovation in one way or another. How do you view that? Is that in a positive way, or does that affect how you might invest or not invest in companies here? Or is that a model that we should see elsewhere?
I think there are two ways in which government can help spur innovation, at least in my sector. I'm a mobility specialist. Most VCs are generalists. We're specialists, so I can speak to something a little bit more narrow. The one is to create space for innovation. So I think, with ride-hailing, many Pacific Northwest and or West Coast cities have been bad. Look at what Portland did to scooters. It's like you launch a scooter and then you get charged a tax. If you own a car, you don't pay that tax. If you ride a scooter, then you are paying this tax, and you have to fill all these other things. Create an opportunity for these services to get deployed, because then it's more likely they're going to be launched in your city, and you're going to be the first to benefit. And more importantly, create the space for this stuff to happen. So micromobility infrastructure, protected bike lanes. Why does Copenhagen have 49% of its commute trips on bicycles,
because it's flat,
and Seattle has 3%, and Vancouver has 4%. It's better exercise if it's not flat. Yeah. They go a long way. They've got these bike highways in Copenhagen. It's pretty damn cool. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and we're seeing, for instance, we both have spent time in Saudi Arabia. I mean, you've got a very deep connection across the GCC, and know lots of people. We're learning about that a lot. I'm based in Israel, so I care a lot about the potential for trade and collaboration. But they're basically seeding a startup ecosystem, and I think you're seeing the same thing in Europe too. There's been this view, Silicon Valley has it, everybody else basically sucks, they don't have the magic. And then Europe just started, pumping out unicorns. Israel's done it for a while, it's been pretty good at it. And then Canada, created Shopify. You've got these examples, and what happens is you've got a layering of innovation once you create what I call a founder factory. And the mobility space really creates those. Uber's a founder factory. Careem in the Middle East is a founder factory in the mobility space. Once you create a successful startup that can scale. So you basically have to create incentives for investors, real investors, that are going to put money into your ecosystem, and founders that are going to start companies. And then you got to wait the maturing process for these companies to mature, because you need experienced founders to help new founders. You got to have kind of a pay it forward model. And I think that's basically how ecosystems mature over time. The last thing is you can kind of have collaboration across ecosystems, especially on the open side, conversations, collaboration. And I think this is something you're really enabling, John. A conversation between peer cities that allows best practices to be replicated.
Yeah, I think that's super important. Olaf, unfortunately, I would love to continue this for several hours, but we come to an end. Thank you very, very much for coming to Vancouver. I expect that RedBlue will be opening up offices here
shortly. I'm mainly here for the running. I don't know if you see my running shoes, but I went running this morning in Vancouver, and my goodness, Seattle's very nice, but it doesn't have this park thing. Whatever that park thing there is really damn awesome.
Well, thank you.
I need more of those.